We'll be starting the session in just over a minute. Welcome to everyone joining us. The session will be starting in a minute. Please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box and say hello. Welcome everyone joining. We'll be starting in 30 seconds. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this Reflections on COP26 from Islanders session. COP26 was almost a month ago, and there was a lot of interesting discussion around this and its impact for particularly small island developing states, but other islands also. And so we're very pleased to have an excellent range of participants who were there in person at COP26 to give a bit of their thoughts and feedback after the dust has started to settle. You can see some people already saying hello in the chat, people from Scotland, from Denmark, from Barbados, from Trinidad, from Portugal, Egypt, Papua New Guinea, Trinidad again, Curacao. It's great to see such a range of people joining us. If you haven't already, do go and say hello in the chat. If you're here on Zoom, and if you're watching on social media, drop us a comment and we'll try and pick those up also. So Island Innovation hosted a COP26 island space. This was the first time that we've done this, and really the goal for us was to connect islanders around the world with what was happening in person on the ground in Scotland, to understand the implications for their communities, and also to try and encourage them to feel involved in the process. One of the really big challenges this year, and this was always a challenge, but was accelerated by COVID, was accessibility, particularly for civil society representatives. Even governments this year from many island countries, especially in the Pacific, had a challenge getting representatives or getting experienced representatives to and from the conference, given all of the regulations around COVID and the fact that some communities in the Pacific have not had regular flights for almost 2 years now. This was even worse in the civil society sector, meaning the NGOs, the other lobbying organizations, all of which play such an important voice at COP. People often think COP is just the negotiations, the people in the room discussing the legal side, but actually the civil society actors in and around the COP26 are really, really important. And as someone who's been to COP for several years now, I really noticed less of the representation this year from small island developing state countries, especially youth and NGO representatives, than there had been in previous sessions. Now, that's not to say that there were not some amazing representatives here, and I'm very happy that they will be joining us today. We have young people joining us from the Caribbean, from the Indian Ocean, and from the Pacific Islands to share their views. I'd now like to invite all of our speakers to go ahead and turn on your cameras, and in no particular order, I'll pick on you one by one to give your initial reflections, 5 minutes or so each, on the COP26 experience for you. Let us know if it was your first time, if you've been many times before, and what you took away from that experience. So you haven't, please go ahead and turn on your cameras, other speakers. And then what we'll do is we have a pretty active chat. I can see people commenting away. So if you have questions, please go ahead for our participants and drop them in the Q&A if you're in Zoom, or post them as a comment if you're on social media. And we'll use that to frame our discussion. And so firstly, I'll go to Chandel O'Neill. Hopefully that's okay with you, Chandel. I can see you on my screen. To go ahead and give us your initial reactions now that dust has settled around COP. Over to you.
Hello, good morning from Trinidad and Tobago. I am Chandel O'Neill. I am a sustainable energy specialist and a human rights advocate. I got the opportunity to attend my first COP in Glasgow as part of the Unite for Climate Action delegation, and I got my badge from Yongo. I first were to describe COP, I'll say intense. It was a very hectic schedule, a lot of running around, a lot of trying to meet people, a lot of trying to get to places, and it was a very big venue, and there's a lot of just moving parts. And especially the first few days, they were still figuring it out on the ground. So that was us participants learning as we go, and the learning curve was pretty steep. Issues with security, just getting into the venue, accessibility around that, transparency, again, tickets to get into the plenaries and all those kind of things. So it was just definitely a learning curve. Happy I got the experience. Hopefully I want to be back. I'm looking more to the SBs. I think that's what I'm more interested in, more technical side. The COP, you could see there was a lot of let's say pomp and circumstance around it, a lot of greenwashing, honestly, and it was a lot of talk, a lot of chit chat, and there was a lot of ego, a lot of fronting, a lot of not necessarily being fully transparent, but seeing what you're supposed to see and these kind of things. So now that the dust is settled, I want to see what actually comes of it, because you set all these pledges on this big global stage. So let's see what you're gonna actually do. So that's my 2 cents, I guess. Thanks.
Thanks, Chandel. And we'll go to the Indian Ocean now. Victoria, I can see you on the screen. Tell us a bit about what your role at the COP was, how you managed to go there, and how you found the experience. Your big takeaways.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Victoria Alice. Currently working as a sustainability consultant. And I was one of the Seychelles youth delegates that attended the Youth for Climate Summit in Italy, in Milan. And from there was kind of just a natural direction towards COP26. Originally, I wasn't really thinking I could go to COP26. I didn't have any funding. But yeah, the COP16 was also quite new to me. Yongo, this year is also, so there's a lot of new things to me this year. But I was lucky enough to get funding from the Environmental Justice Foundation. And they funded my whole trip to COP26, and my Seychelles delegation kind of took me under the wing, and I was lucky enough to shadow one of our negotiators for response measures. So I was truly privileged, because so many people who had worked for a long time and really wanted to be at COP26 couldn't, for so many different reasons, whether it was issues with visas, with funding, you name it. So the fact that I got to go to COP26 and I was able to go to the streets, I was able to go to the side events, and I was able to go to the negotiation rooms was really eye-opening, because I had I get this image of COP26, and once you're in there, as Chandel was saying, the first day you need a whole day just to orient yourself and know what's where you need to go, and you have a schedule, but then the schedule is updated every day as well. So you have to go on the UNFCCC website and make sure you're following, and there's just so many spontaneous things happening at the same time. What I did, obviously one of my things was I wasn't a negotiator, but I really wanted to amplify what had been said, what had been put in the Global Youth Declaration. So there was the one from the Y4C and one from COP16. So in my way, through media, through different ways, I wanted to amplify some of those demands, and that reflected what was needed on behalf of SIDS as well. And I really did see a disconnect between what was being done in the negotiation rooms and what was being said in the side events. And I would kind of switch one from the other. And Chandel mentioned greenwashing, and I really can echo that. I think there was a lot of promises made by people with authority, people in power, which is good because, you want to be positive in the side events. You want to show ambition. You want to show, okay, this is the way forward, and you want to be positive. But, at the end of the day, if it doesn't reflect what's going to be put in the outcome document, which is key for COP26, at the end of the day, we want what is being said in the public to be reflected on paper. And I felt there was a true disconnect. And in terms of transparency and, inclusivity, I think the first week, the fact that, for some thematic areas such as mitigation, climate finance, the big topics that everyone wanted to follow, the rooms were full very quick, which means that all the observers, whether it's UNFCCC constituencies or NGOs, couldn't get in. So there was truly a lack of transparency, because even though there were screens inside the rooms, you couldn't actually say anything if you weren't inside the negotiation room. So I think that was echoed and highlighted in the second week. But I was quite surprised to see that, we called it a hybrid COP. I didn't feel like it was such a hybrid at the end of the day. So yeah, I think that there's some good things to recognize that came out of COP26. I think from a CITES point of view, we really wanted to have that ocean dialogue integrated in the outcome document, and we did see a lot of that being integrated in the Glasgow Climate Pact. But when we look at loss and damage, that was quite a disappointment, and there were a few disappointments, to be honest. Absolutely. So yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Victoria. And I think it's really important for people who haven't been to COP to realize that COP is not just one thing. There are all these different spaces, and you have to figure out where are you going. And actually, one thing might be happening on the other side of Glasgow. It's almost like the conference takes up the entire city. I found myself going to different meetings in maybe a hotel on the other side, or these other venues that were popping up, and each of those were catering to a slightly different audience. Some were really aimed at involving the Scottish audience locally in the process, but the negotiations, which are really the center of the COP, are actually very few people have access to them, and even fewer this year than in the past. And I agree, sitting in the negotiations for me was eye-opening to see these countries personified. America walks in and says one thing, South Africa says something else, and you see people talking on behalf of the entire country. But the CIDS countries having such a powerful voice in those. And I think it's widely agreed that many of the CIDS negotiators are some of the best negotiators, not just within the CIDS, but of all the negotiators that people really look up to as well. And so we'll come back to you for some more reflections on your experience within negotiating rooms as well. Kim, you are from Papua New Guinea, and thank you so much for staying up late for us tonight to be here and talk. We really appreciate that. Would welcome your thoughts. Was it your first time at COP? You've been before. Specifically, the Pacific Islands were very underrepresented this year in comparison because of the travel restrictions that were in place. And I definitely noticed fewer Pacific activists. So I'm really glad that you were able to be there in person. But how did it feel as a Pacific Islander and as your first COP? Tell us your perspective, please.
Thank you, James, and greetings everyone listening, tuning in online, and greetings to you from Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. My name is Kim Allen. It's 13 past 12 a.m. here in Port Moresby, PNG, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, James. My reflections or takeaways from the COP26, it's my first COP. By the way, I am a student, and I went to COP as a youth representative from the Pacific region. Together with fellow other Pacific youths. And it was funded by the Climate Action PICAN, the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, and also with support from Climate Justice Foundation. And yes, it was a challenging in terms of time zones, and especially for geography. The lack of representation started when, as Vicky mentioned, when we were in Italy, the Youth for Climate Summit, because some of our fellow Youth Pacific attendees didn't show up or didn't attend because of the situation in terms of the pandemic. And so as you can understand the challenges. Now, let me make mention while I speak right now, the impacts of climate change and especially sea level rise is currently affecting the Pacific region. And there are many displaced communities, including Solomon Islands, Fiji, and PNG across the country, especially with coastal communities. Currently, if you search on the net, you will see that communities have been displaced because of sea level rise currently as I speak. And yeah, it's really sad. And coming back to my reflections on the COP, there were some, especially from the youth perspective, as Vicky mentioned, we did collated youth responses, and it was well received by the leaders. The global leaders were there listening to youth perspectives, and I think this goes to the credit with the Youth for Climate Summit in Italy, and also the Conference of Youth through Yongo in their efforts to collate youth perspectives across. But as I said, the lack of representation from the Pacific youths because of the situation. And two is the resistance from developed countries. I didn't have that opportunity to get into the negotiation rooms, but I was following within the group, and noticed that there is resistance from developed countries towards climate financing, and the lack of support on loss and damage, and especially with adaptation. And I think that's one of the main challenges for developing countries, especially the Pacific and including other seeds. And it was also to know that such funding driven by private sector, especially when they are released. And that was the kind of conversation that we were having within the youth CSOs. And the third one is the lack of assessment, because the COP26 itself was supposed to be follow-up from Paris Agreement and the others. Now, this was my first COP, but I have been following the COP events and reading on the Paris Agreement. So I noticed that there was lack of assessment and tracking on the progression of all the COPs, including Paris. But most emphasis, as you've mentioned, James, in your earlier comment, that countries were there for their representation and for their political dialogues without addressing the issue itself, which is climate financing and the others. So it was quite sad to see that with the outcome. Yes, we commend the Pacific Islands for their, especially the governments and the climate activists there, for raising the voices across the region. And of course, with the support from other small island developing states, there was a fair representation. But I believe there should be more, especially at the negotiation table, to give them the space and the opportunity, especially to have a fair dialogue with the superpowers, the developed countries. And yes, I think that's from my end, and we'll be happy to discuss more in the follow-up conversations.
Thanks so much, Kim. Really appreciate that. It's good to have a Pacific perspective in these discussions as well. I realize we have 3 people with us from the Caribbean, all of whom are joining us from Trinidad and Tobago. It's great to see Trinis representing in this conversation. Racquel, you were there in several different roles as CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, but also as one of the UNFCCC's global ambassadors, the only one from a SIDS country, which I think is super important. This was your first COP?
It was my first COP, yeah.
So how did you find that? Tell us about your experience.
So it was overwhelming, it was disorienting, it was confusing. We had like you were talking about, you don't realize the massive scale of this event. So we would have picked 2 events and said, okay, we scheduled this at 10 and this at 11, not realizing that they're an hour away. And so, either on foot or leaving one venue and heading to another. And so it was a lot of sort of recalibrating when we got there to figure out, okay, how do we navigate this massive space? But, and I think, to be fair on the organizers, it was impressive to many degrees. I mean, the daily testing requirements to try and keep us all safe, being able to pull something of that scale off in these times, I think, hats off to them, because I would go crazy if I was trying to put something like that together. And I think it just helped me think about how not just sort of individually vulnerable we are, but I feel like there's no sort of big nefarious plot, whereas any of the individuals that you talk to, everybody wants the same thing, but everybody has different stakeholders that they have to answer to, and they are beholden to those stakeholders in one way or the other. So I think this, for me, I walked away thinking about, despite the progress and some of the lack of progress that we had coming out of this COP and all of the ground we have left to cover that we're not moving fast enough to cover, it really is about building bridges to help people to get to where we need them to get to as quickly as possible. Because if we keep thinking about it in terms of us and them, or, you know, there's no political will. Political will is driven by the people. So we have to get to the people. We have to get to the people who influence the politicians to take the right decisions quickly enough to save us all.
Absolutely. And I think it is really important to remember that as important as the negotiations are, there are so many different things, and I want to underline that point so much, that came out of COP. And one of the questions you can start thinking about that I want to ask you was, what positives came out of COP? Because there was so much negativity around it. And in my view, the way that it was reported by the media, it was always going to be a failure. It was very difficult for something to come out of this, especially in the challenges that we're in. So as much as we do want to discuss the failures, of which there were many and some big ones, I would love your inputs from the panel when we come back to this on what the positives came out of this. And if, I mean, you can tell me there's none if you think so, but hopefully we'll have some. Zico, you were there as a journalist, as well as a kind of a youth representative from the Caribbean, and so maybe you had some different perspectives on how things were evolving, and also how you were able to communicate what was happening in Glasgow with the general public in Trinidad and Tobago. And so I think this is one of the challenges. How do you make the general public worldwide understand what's happening, and see why it matters to them? So how did you go about doing that, and what was your experience like? You're on mute.
I'm muted now. All right, hey everyone. So I had the opportunity to attend COP26 as a journalist through Climate Tracker's Climate Justice Journalism Fellowship Program. And for me, this was my first time going to a COP event. So like everyone else, I must say it was really overwhelming, but at the same time, it was quite invigorating, because it immediately became clear to me that there is a gap in terms of the capacity for reporting in many small island states, because reporting on climate is so technical that you need dedicated reporters who have read policy documents, who have followed COP from year to year, because COP is like a sitting of a parliament. And usually if you're a reporter who's doing politics or reporting on parliament, you have to sort of you have to really be ingrained in the culture of how that goes, and how different documents are evolving, and what are the implications of the different types of language, because the language is so technical, and these negotiators are basically going back and forth sometimes over whether they should use the word encourages or the word urges. And it really requires a certain level of attention to details and understanding of these documents and of negotiations in the past to be able to meaningfully report on the negotiations. So for me, arriving there, I pretty quickly realized that I was probably the only independent reporter at COP26 from a small island state. Someone spoke to me and requested from the presidency a list of reporters from small island states, and the presidency refused. And through their research, this is another reporter, they were able to determine that I was likely the only one there independently. There were a few other people who were maybe attached to delegations. So that immediately made me realize that there is a need to hear from people from small island states who report on these negotiations, but report on it from the perspective of somebody who's going to be impacted on the front line of the climate crisis, that actually lives in a small island state. So when you look at perhaps the levels of engagement, I know in my country, in Trinidad and Tobago, people aren't as engaged in climate action as they should be. They don't necessarily see climate change as an urgent threat that we're living through right now. In small island states, I'm sure most of you would know that COVID and other issues are much more at the forefront of our minds. So this COP, for me, I immediately saw that this was an opportunity to occupy a niche that was vacant. Because I think one of the best ways to get people more engaged in small island states and to understand that some of the adverse weather events that they're already experiencing right now are linked to climate change is to really have more engagement from Caribbean media, because reporting on climate is distinct from reporting on the environment. So by being there, I was able to, I guess, build capacity. I was able to really identify the gap in rhetoric and action. So political leaders give a lot of speeches. There's a lot of civil society participation, and the negotiations are behind closed doors. So when you turn on a television, your experience of COP is going to be a lot of the gloss, the political speeches, etc. And if you're reporting on COP from home, you're going to carry a lot of this verbatim and present it to your audience. And sometimes, I guess the advantage of being there as a reporter is you can speak to negotiators who are working on behalf of a country or a party, and they'll help you identify that, hey, maybe this is what our leader is saying, but he's saying it because, or perhaps they're saying this, but they're doing something else in the background. So as a reporter who's actually there, you have the opportunity to get to another layer of the story. And you could say, okay, perhaps this is what's being said by the political leader on stage, but this is what's happening in the background. So that's why it's so important. It was important, I think, for me to be there, and hopefully to see more reporters have this opportunity for future COPs, so that we can carry these stories that really dig beneath the surface from our perspective. I mean, I could look at some, I guess, bring up some controversial points, but in Trinidad and Tobago, we are an oil and gas economy, so obviously I would have been examining what my prime minister would have been saying on the world stage versus our actual commitments through our NDCs to mitigation, etc. Identify those gaps. And that extra level of reporting, I think, comes about when you get to actually be in the room. So seeing our absence, I think that was, it overwhelmed me, because I realized I couldn't possibly keep up with everything. I think no matter how you go to COP, you're going to immediately realize that you have to come up with a strategy and a plan really quickly, and you have to be focused on whatever you're going to focus on, because you can be pulled in so many different directions. And if you're from a small island state, you'll feel like you have to do it all, because there may not be other people there. But you have to really come up with a plan. Like for me, I really looked into loss and damage, identifying gaps between rhetoric and action, and that was my experience at COP26. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Zika. That was very helpful. The media experience is something that I think often gets overlooked, the importance of the media. But for small island nations, or small nations in general, very few media representatives get to be there in person at COP. And so the work that Dizan does at Climate Tracker, and also having, you had Bishani, who was also one of your reporters, who was not physically there, but was kind of able to report remotely, and supporting journalists from countries to actually hold their delegations to account and report what is happening, I think is really important. And would love to see more media representation from SIDS countries be able to attend there. So well done. And if you want to share some of the articles, if you have some links handy, maybe you can put them in the chat, just so people get an idea of the types of stuff that you were covering. So last but not least, Emily, and then we'll go into a discussion. Emily, you were there representing Peace Boat, and you can tell us a little bit about Peace Boat, and also representing a wide range of islands that are involved in your program. And you, I think, are the most senior of us as COP attendees, having attended a lot of COPs. So you've probably seen the differences before and after COVID as well that you can comment on. So over to you.
Thank you so much, James, and good morning, everyone. I'm Emily McClone from Peace Boat US. I work as the director of the international organization Peace Boat, based in New York City. So it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I just want to say congratulations, first of all, to everyone on this panel for, being at COP and being a part of the programs and really participating, because I think that is something that I'd like to highlight just in my reflections, is that actually participating and being part of this program in general and the conference itself is such a huge endeavor. And especially for small island developing states, as we mentioned, there was, as everyone here, I'd like to echo, not enough representation. And so everyone that's, participating today, even virtually, I would just want to say thank you for being here. And also for Island Innovation, it's been amazing to see the online presence. I think that was one thing that was extremely important this year, because so many people weren't able to be present at COP in person. The online presence and the feedback and presenting of reports and things that were taking place during the event was extremely important. So thank you for that as well. For our organization, I've been working with Peace Boat now almost 18 years in many different capacities, but it was actually my second COP that I was organizing at. So I was at Madrid in COP25, and I thought really having Madrid be the second venue for COP, for example, was supposed to be held in Chile in South America, as some people know. I thought that was a huge challenge, and reorganizing all of our events and going to COP25 was a lot of work. And COP26 turned out to be even more work because of the global pandemic and everything that people here on the panel mentioned today. And so I thought it would be interesting just to give a few reflections, but also to give some insight and maybe some tips also on how we ended up organizing some of the things that we were able to coordinate within the 2 weeks. I think as Peace Boat, we actually coordinated around 14 events during the 2-week period, sometimes 2 events in one day, including press conferences and dinner, evening receptions, which provided spaces for networking outside of the formal negotiations. So I just thought it would be interesting to share that with you all. So I'm going to try and share my screen here, and just to give a few images also for those of you who weren't able to be maybe at the event. And so I'm just going to go full screen here if everybody can see that okay. First of all, just to introduce a little bit about why I was participating in COP and how this was coming together. So I work as a director of Peace Boat US, as I mentioned. We're based in the United Nations Plaza in New York. Our headquarters of Peace Boat is in Tokyo. And one of our flagship programs is our Ocean and Climate Youth Ambassador Program, which brings together young people from small island developing states to share their perspectives and meet with government representatives and also United Nations diplomats. And this has been taking place on board the Peace Boat, was also formally endorsed by COP23. So COP is a very important venue for us to make sure that young people have a voice at the table. And one of the first events that we organized was a press conference. So this is just the press conference room. So you can see, and we decided to invite always to these press conferences our youth leaders. So we had Natalia Lawen, who's from the Seychelles, as one of the speakers here with the founder of Peace Boat. These press conferences are a great way, I thought, for organizations and partners to share their voice. They're typically around 30 minutes long and organized online. So you have the speakers and panels in person, but everything is broadcasted through the COP system. And then it's also featured on the COP website so that reporters can then access that information and write about the activities that are taking place. So I would encourage anyone who has been working in media, especially, or wanting to get the voice out there, to also think about press conferences at COP as a way in the future to share your voices. And those are available online. You can actually apply for press conference space through the COP website. So these were things that we were learning as we were going along. Each COP is different, and so we were preparing as we went. Another space that was really inclusive, I thought, was the Sdg Pavilion, which also came about very late in the game. They presented their pavilion just about a week and a half before COP. So many people and organizations were looking for spaces to share their work. And we were, also wondering how we can participate. So this was the Sdg Pavilion. We were able to bring in different organizations and different perspectives. Peace Boat, this year, we actually were able to provide 9 delegation passes. So we shared those delegation passes, again, with our youth from small island developing states and also with different organizations. We sponsored representatives from March for Science, from EarthX, from the Ocean Acidification Alliance, and many others to be able to participate in COP this year. So it was great that the Sdg Pavilion welcomed many different partners working on the SDGs, and these are just a few photos. We also had representatives from Blue Planet Alliance in our delegation, and we had youth also here from Montserrat. Ashneil Jeffers is one of those youth, and I think he was the only youth representative, or maybe only representative overall at COP, he said, from Montserrat. And then again, we always try to aim to bring these voices together with government partners. So we also have here the new ambassador, Ambassador Seed from Palau, who's a representative to the United Nations. And so she also joined us for these events. We took advantage as well of the online platforms that many partners were providing. This was Ocean Action Day, which was on the 5th of November. And we had an online platform and discussion with youth leaders together with our partners from Sustainable Ocean Alliance. So I also found that this was a really useful way to engage, especially young people and those who are online, if they weren't there, to take advantage of presenting these special days that were taking place during COP, but online. And I'm sure that Island Innovation was very active in doing a lot of things like this as well as others. So I would encourage people to think about that for next year as well. And then, of course, we had this meeting with Nicola Sturgeon, which was organized by Island Innovation and partners. And again, the youth representatives that came here, as well as Racquel, who's here online, joined. And I thought that was a wonderful experience to be able to have everyone together at one table and discussing the issues, and also hearing from the perspective of those who were organizing events, especially being in Glasgow. So that was really important for everyone to attend. And then having representatives from Palau, again, I was mentioning how we were working towards involving government partners. We were able to hold this side event at the Sdg Pavilion for the Alliance of Small Island States. And this also came about, actually was coordinated while we were at COP. So it was not an event that we had been able to organize beforehand, but we were able to bring in our youth leaders. Kim, who is also here, represented from Papua New Guinea, was also able to join us as a speaker, as well as youth from Fiji and again, Montserrat. But we also were able to announce here the Our Ocean Conference from Palau. So not only speaking about things that were taking place at COP, but also looking forward, I think, to future events and building that bridge. I think COP can be a really great platform and a space for people to come together and then continue those relationships. So one of our major, I guess, focuses this year was partnerships. And then, as James also mentioned, things were taking place also outside of the venue. So we held an event at the Marriott Hotel, which gave us more accessibility to local partners and also those who might not have had an official badge. So this was together with the Blue Planet Alliance and EarthX. And again, the Youngo constituency here, I thought was really important at COP. So I would encourage any young leaders who are out there from small island developing states and anywhere around the world, especially island nations, though, to be involved with Youngo. It is easy to become a member, and they have a great support system, and they are very active at COP. And I think that really shared youth leaders. And then lastly, the reception dinners. And of course, this is where we got to interact with partners outside of the venue. So having those spaces and dynamic conversations was really important to us this year. And I hope that we can be a support as an organization that provides space for partnerships to really reach out to those of you who are online and help for next year's COP. It's going to be another big challenge. So I'm looking forward to helping and supporting everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Emily. And it's really great to see the work that Peace Boat does to support young people, especially. We're really happy to encourage members of our network to apply when you've had the opportunities for SIDS youth in the past, and hopefully will be more of those in the future too. Okay, we've heard a wide range of voices. There's some good questions coming in. If you're in the attendees, please do send in your questions and we'll address them. But I'm going to go back to what I alluded to before. And so I'll ask our panelists to raise their hand, either give me a wave on screen or use the Zoom function to raise your hand if you want to answer this. But what were the positives? I mean, we can come back to the failures, which have been well covered, but what positives or maybe glimmers of hope did you see as an attendee of the COP this year? Who wants to take that one first? Chandal, go for it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. the Glasgow Work Program, Action for Climate Empowerment, had a lot of mentions of youth. So that was a big work, I know the team who worked on that. So yeah, right there, youth mentioned in some documents. Yeah.
That's great. I think that youth representation is really important. Kim, you're off screen. Do you want to come on camera? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, James. I just want to add on to the opportunity to engage and network with fellow young people, and also learning from them what they do, especially at the community level and across every sector. And two is the exposure to share those ideas, and especially exposure to such networks like Peace Boat. Having those discussions with the First Minister and other world leaders at that stage, it's a privilege and an opportunity for young people, because we are from the young people or youth CSOs. And yeah, I think that's the 2 points stood out for me. And yes, thank you to the people. There was so much warm reception by the people in Glasgow. So everywhere you go, they're so welcoming and supportive, and yeah, pointing you to the directions if you get confused. It's really lovely to be in that place. Thank you.
Well, one thing I had a couple of times was you could see that there were people in the city wanting to engage in the COP, seeing all this happening, but not really knowing what was happening. And so people would just say, "Oh, you're wearing a badge. Like, what are you doing here?" And kind of, I think it's a shame almost that there weren't more ways. Although the Glasgow City Council and Scottish Government did really try and do that, there's not more ways of helping people see that. But no, Scottish people are great like that. I love how they'll pick up a conversation from nowhere. And of course, you mentioned First Minister Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland. And part of the reason this came together was that I think all of you here were part of a meeting that was held the Island Innovation organised with the First Minister and the Scottish Government to bring together. And I think it was really inspiring. I missed out on it because I got COVID, of course, but it was really inspiring to hear those of you who did attend here that the First Minister was very enthusiastic about meeting with young people and hearing those young people's voices. So if anyone has any comments on that meeting with the First Minister from the Scottish perspective that they'd like to share, that would be great, or any other positive outcomes that they wanted to review from their COP experience. Racquel?
Yeah, no, I mean that meeting with First Minister was phenomenal, and in a lot of ways, because I thought that she talked about all of the progress that they'd made in renewable energy and new policies that they'd put in place, but she also talked about the gaps that they're still left to close, and was, I found, incredibly authentic about, listen, we haven't solved this, and the $1 million that we're putting towards loss and damage, we're hoping that creates a catalyst that then results in greater action. So, I mean, it felt like it wasn't just one of those sort of photo op moments for me. I felt like she was really sort of sharing from a position of, here are the things that are going well, here are the things that are not going well. We are really trying to close the gaps, but we have the best interest and intent in mind. I had a similar experience to you, James, in that one day I was walking to the venue and this old guy was sort of walking along and he sort of struck up a conversation. He's like, so why are you here? And how did you manage to come? And how did you get here? And how are you finding it? And is it useful? And I said, oh, so I, started asking him some questions. And I said, so are you just on your daily walk? He says, well, every morning I just get up and I try and meet somebody on the way. So I just walk from my home to the venue and have a chat so I can understand what's going on. And it was just so sweet. And I think it was just indicative of all of the people that I met there, the local people that I met there. They were just so accommodating and so sweet. And even when we met with the First Minister, she said, it's been a bit, for a lot of people, it's been a bit inconvenient because they had to close off transportation routes and whatever. And you wouldn't tell it to be there. They were just so warm and welcoming and wholesome in opening up their city toughs. But some of the other positives for me, certainly the progress on the carbon market, certainly the progress on methane, certainly the progress on deforestation, private sector getting really deeply involved and coming up with solutions, again, making commitments that we need to track through to action, but also the UN taking on the role of saying, again, maybe a little late, but saying, listen, we need to track these commitments because commitments in and of themselves are not enough. But the level of activism that I saw, especially among the youth, the old and the young, but especially among the youth, was overwhelming in the best possible way. I mean, when I met Chandel, she, and Zico, really having great insight, Victoria and Kim just filled my heart, and Ashneel, just filled my heart, because there's so much knowledge and information, and even some of the interviews that we did with youth-led organizations, best interviews we had. So a lot gave me a lot of hope, but it's just that this isn't going to happen if we just sort of sit back. We're going to have to fight every day to make this happen. And of course, my meeting with President Obama made my life for a little bit. And there were members of Youngo there. So I'm like, listen, if no other reason to join Youngo, that it might open a door to meet with President Obama. I think there were far more positives than negatives for me. And I think all of the things that did not quite go right, I think enough of the things went right that will be a catalyst to close the gaps. We just have to know that no one else is going to solve this. So you have to say to yourself, whatever didn't happen, this is what I'm willing to do to close that gap, or join an organization or get involved in some way so that you are a part of the solution. Otherwise, you're a part of the problem.
Absolutely, with all of that. And I think part of our goal for the Island Innovation Platform was to also include islands that do not have a formal seat at the table. So the SIDS member states of the UN, any independent country, has a seat at the table and has their own delegation. But it was mentioned Montserrat. I also see we have quite a few attendees from Bermuda. As UK Overseas Territories, they are represented by the London delegation, who may or may not have the same interests as those territories. Equally, you have places like Puerto Rico or French Polynesia, which do not have their direct representation, which is why I think it's really important that these youth constituencies and NGO constituencies come in to make sure those voices are heard. In the Scottish context, the Scottish Islands clearly have different interests than London do as well. And it's really inspiring to see the number of solutions coming from Scotland, and particularly Orkney is well known, but also Egg and Shetland and the Outer Hebrides all have renewable energy projects, waste management projects that have a wider applicability. And so when we do our events and networks, we really want to showcase, okay, Scottish Islands are a small part of a much larger country. They don't have that seat at the table, but there is a really exciting opportunity because many of the experiences that they have, whether it's high energy costs or dependency on tourism or difficulties in waste management, apply to the SIDS countries. And this was an interesting opportunity to start to build some more of those connections for sharing work. And I'll share in the chat a link for those of you who are not aware of what's happening in Orkney, which is really inspiring. Victoria, over to you.
There we go. Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Racquel was saying, and I think that meeting with the First Minister, and I need to thank Emily for kind of giving me that opportunity to attend the meeting. Thank you, Emily. It really reflects that networking opportunity that you get from COP26, and it was really Racquel used the word authentic, and it did feel authentic. I think this particular individual, this politician, was kept in the background for quite a while. Surprisingly, she's kind of the host, but she was doing a lot of work, but it was not necessarily at the forefront, and she did a lot in the back end, in the background. And for her to share the work she's been doing with different stakeholders, and obviously there's this key, there's a lot of disappointment with the loss and damage thematic area under the Glasgow Climate Pact. But then, you engage with her, and then she explains more about the £2 million for the loss and damage fund that Glasgow has injected. And as she said, it's just a drop of what needs to be done, but hey, it's the first government that has actually mobilized the funds for loss and damage, and it makes you realize, well, yeah, okay, that I think it's easy to feel defeated, and it's easy to give in negativity. But as Racquel was saying, it is also important to remain positive and recognize the fact that a lot of good things did come out, and so many important partnerships and collaborations came out from COP26, and being able to have that insight from firsthand First Minister, I think is something to be to talk about and to recognize, and yeah. So yes, thanks again, Emily.
Thank you, Victoria, for that. And another question that's come up, which I'll throw into the mix, but feel free to answer points that were already raised as well, if you want to raise your hand, speakers. Massimiliano has asked what were the most relevant and important outcomes of COP26 for the Caribbean SIDS. I'll extend that to all SIDS. I mean, what were the most relevant and important outcomes of COP26 when it comes to SIDS? And maybe this is more of a negotiation kind of point of view. And also of the proposed follow-up actions, what will realistically happen for SIDS in the short term? So that's also been asked, and I can see I'm not going to get to all of these questions, I'm sorry, but there's some really good questions. So speakers, do have a look in the chat and feel free to type in an answer. Gerald Lindo asked, I saw there was an announcement of the Global Energy Alliance for People and the Planet. Any perspectives from attendees on this approach to providing climate finance should islands respond to this initiative? So lots of points coming up. Who wants to dive in? Don't be shy. I mean, Victoria, going back to you, because I think you of all the people have the most exposure to the negotiations. Maybe you can comment on what things look like. I mean, obviously there were so many negotiations. You were only in a small part of them. It's physically impossible to be in all of them. Were there any things that you saw that SIDS and other countries, developed countries, like really drew strong divisions between them, and anything that you saw from SIDS negotiators that they really wanted to get across in those meetings?
So I mainly followed response measures. Like that was, yeah, that's the main one that I followed. And it really was essentially a couple of individuals talking about the draft text. You had quite a few parties, but you've got US, you have the EU, you have African group. Our negotiator wasn't negotiating on behalf of Seychelles, but she was negotiating on behalf of AOSIS. So that's also something important to recognize, is that AOSIS really groups up everyone. And I think there were definitely, I was told it's a bit of game of chess, these negotiations. And, I think Zico mentioned the fact that you can spend a very long time on a word, whether it's should we add appreciated or not appreciated, should it be should or shall. And I mean, I guess between what SIDS were looking for and what developed countries were coming in with, there wasn't a clear. There were divisions, and you could see why certain people didn't want, this particular word to be included, because then that would mean, finance would need to be injected there to be able to develop the response measures at another level. But yeah, I guess there wasn't anything major. It was more in the details. Yeah, it was more in the details.
Fantastic. Chandel, you have spoken the least, I think, so I want to hear more from you and your opinion. So go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump in and see it. It's not necessarily from a cis perspective, but just from like a human perspective. I'm pretty happy that the whole issue with gender kind of got nullified in the end, because in the middle it was kind of like a whole geopolitical scene, just somebody trying to cause some drama, just trying to flex some will. So it's not necessarily.
Can you explain it a little bit more, just so people have the background?
Okay, well, in the official text documents for certain things, they wanted to remove all mentions of, like, I think it was like gender and human rights in the official documents, in terms of like what people can do in the beginning, and because certain parties were blocking it, because But this is what the whole thing with the UN is, that everybody has to come to consensus. So if a party blocks it, it's just trying to start some drama and some bacchanal. And this was happening in the first week, but it just came down by the end of it that it got put back in. It was just flexing some geopolitical wheel, making people sweat a little bit just because they could. But it's very disheartening that gender and like human rights were used as like a little kind of just like hanging fruit kind of a thing just to play around with. But it got put back in the end, so it might not necessarily be a win for SIDS, but I think it's a win for all humans. And I think from a SIDS perspective, I think a lot of SIDS were looking at the loss and damage. So the weak outcome, or at least we got to mention on a few things of loss and damage, is just a major blow to SIDS in general, because loss and damage is our reality, and not acknowledging that properly just kind of perpetuates a very, very messed up, broken system right now. So thanks.
For someone who is maybe unaware of the links between gender and human rights and climate change, what would you say? I mean, what should people know? Why should the agreement talk about gender? I'm being a devil's advocate, but I want to hear you kind of just explain for the wider audience what the link is there.
Okay, well, across all facets of everything, agriculture, economy, climate change, existing in the world, water, access to basic human rights, women and children and gender is a major factor. It comes into play in how people can access things, the security levels, the safety levels. So even in climate change, you can see that women and girls are more vulnerable just in terms of, I think the statistic was because of the pandemic and everything happening last year, 4 million girls will not finish education because they get either married or for they're more prone to violence and just other things that take you off track from life. Women are more generally doing what is referred to as unpaid work and care work in the home, being the backbones of society. And they're also more likely to be, in terms of agriculture, in certain countries, they're more likely to be farmers. So when there are weather impacts from climate change, they're more adversely impacted. So it's just across all facets of human existence, gender comes into play, and not acknowledging that properly in the climate crisis is just going to perpetuate the system and not actually fix anything at all. So we just need to be, because even if we survive climate change by the turn of this century, we're not even expected to hit gender parity for like the next century. So no matter what we do, we just have to be better in gender. And since climate change is the next big thing we're tackling, let's not forget the big thing that we keep doing wrong with it, which is gender. So let's just bring that into the forefront right away. But parties were using it as a little hanging fruit in negotiations just to mess with people. So yeah, thanks.
That was excellently put. So thank you for that. That was really succinctly and well positioned. And it's, yeah, absolutely tragic that will be used as a bargaining chip as politics comes into these things. Okay, we're going to wrap up shortly. So I'll ask each of our panelists to give us their parting words, parting thoughts from this discussion, and anything else that people can follow up with the work that they're doing. About 30 seconds each. So Zico, over to you first.
Okay. So from people from small island states, I think absolutely need to be present at these negotiations. From a reporting perspective, one of the challenges I would have faced beyond identifying the gap between rhetoric and action was really putting a human face sometimes to the negotiations that would be happening, but one that would be like relatable and accessible to people back home. Because if people don't turn on the television and see themselves there, then sometimes it might not be as compelling to them, which was why it was a really critical moment when Mia Mottley captured the world's attention. Because for many people from small island states, she has a lot of respect in the Caribbean. And for many people who aren't engaged on climate issues, that speech was probably the first speech they'd ever seen that spelled out the crisis so clearly for them and let them know that, hey, this is happening right now and we're living through it. So we need to keep speaking. We need to keep being present in the room, and that will advance our cause.
Thank you. Racquel? I think Racquel has frozen. Emily?
Yes, I'd say my last reflection is just really to, be innovative and to be creative when approaching COP. As everyone here mentioned, it's not such an easy venue or conference to participate in, but we do have to work together to make it more inclusive. And I think just supporting each other and finding ways to be collaborative and bring people in from all the partners that you imagine that you work with, whether it be virtually or in person, I think is the way forward. So just try to be as creative as you can when approaching these major conferences and look for partnerships ahead of time, but then work together with your networks and just, try to be as present and participative as you can.
Thank you, Emily. Victoria?
Well, I guess for me, having taken part in the Y4C and COP, it reminded me that it's great to attend these global conferences, and yeah, it's an amazing networking opportunity. But then it reminds you that we really have to make sure that when we go back home, the work is done on a local level, and we bring things back at the local level. And I think the work to COP27 doesn't start next week or next year. It's got to start now. And I think from what we've learned from COP26, yeah, it's using the resources that we have, the partners that we have, and basically trying to strategize for COP27, whether we're government, whether we're youth groups, whether we're NGOs. I think it's a matter of strategizing for COP27.
Kim?
Thank you, James. It's a privilege to attend COP and those lessons learned, and currently sharing those experiences at the national and regional level here in Pacific. And I think one thing is appreciating the intergenerational dialogue with the leaders out there and to learn from them and also cooperate, because there's so much lessons and wisdom to be learned from the elders and the leaders present at COP. So those takeaways are very important, and seeing the whole process from a youth perspective is very important, because this will pave the way for it, especially at the national level, at the local level, and even when we are participating in those forums in the future, when you are at the position where you are at the decision-making table, then you will remember those moments. And number two is that every citizen, either whether you're a youth or at the community level, you can do something that is very critical or that can contribute to addressing climate impacts, whether it's nature-based solution or traditional approach. It's very important that we do our part as individuals while and at the same time attend those to raise those voices at international forums. And yeah, thank you so much to Scotland and Glasgow for the nice warm welcome. Look, I got myself an Orkney muffin, sorry. The host family that I was staying with gave me an Orkney muffin. She's from Orkney, by the way. And because I'm from the island, the couples gave me this. So I remember Scotland. Thank you, James. Over.
Oh, that's amazing. I actually studied my master's in Orkney as well. So fun fact, so I have a connection there. Chandel?
I'll echo certain sentiments shared before. I am glad I got the opportunity to attend COP. It was my first COP. I also see from attending COP how far we still have to go and how much this is in the end. You just have to get back home, get more people involved, and come back better next year. Just keep improving, keep getting better, because it's the only option we have at this point. So, and thank you for the opportunity to share my views today. Island Innovation, James and Emil. Thank you for, well, Emily, thank you for getting me on this boat and everything. So it was cool, and this is not the last you heard from me, and I'll be around. So thanks.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone for your time today and your insights. That was super interesting. We could easily be here for another hour with these discussions, and I apologize for everyone who submitted questions that we didn't get to, but we will share the chat and the Q&A with our panelists in case they want to follow up on anything. We will be planning for next year similar coverage around COP to try and make sure we have that bridge from the COP location, which will be Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt next year, to islands around the world. And in the meantime, we'll also have a number of other events. So you might have seen in the chat our Island Finance Forum coming up in April, which will a topic very relevant to this, talking about finance available to islands and SIDS and alternative mechanisms for financing projects. So please do sign up for that one. With that, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.